Once again to ARTBreak, everyone. And I think, as you all certainly know by now, today is Halloween. And as you also know, if you've been driving around at all, it's very much in evidence in all these elaborate displays in front of houses to celebrate the day. And to give you some idea of how serious and big a thing Halloween has become, it's estimated that this year that Halloween-related sales will be over $12 billion, with a billion with a B. And this is a record, and last year was also a record. So there's definitely an interesting uptick in interest in celebrating this event. Which leads us to wonder what is the origin of some of these images and traditions that we found associated with Halloween, the ghosts, goblins, witches, devils, and so forth. And today we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. James Palmitessa to discuss this and put it into a historical context. Dr. Palmitessa is an associate professor of history at WMU, and his specialty is history of the late Middle Ages and early modern period, which is essentially a time frame from the 15th to the 17th centuries. And among the courses he teaches there is one entitled The Great European Witch Hunt. So with expertise in both the cultural history and everyday life of this period, I think Dr. Palmitessa brings with us some real unique and special insights about this very common and clearly much loved holiday. So please welcome Dr. James Palmitessa.
So thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Miriam Thomas for inviting me to give the talk. Happy Halloween to everyone, to those who are here at the KIA, and to those who are at home or elsewhere viewing the live stream. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon in this wonderful Kalamazoo institution dedicated to visual culture, to share with you some images of witches, goblins, devils in the history of Halloween. I also have now some Halloween candy to share with you. You can do that. I have someone helping me to do that. I'm distributing the candy not only because that's what we do on Halloween, but I'm going to be talking about these ghostly gummies and sour vampire bats later in the talk. And unfortunately, those who are viewing live stream don't get to get any candy. Maybe that will encourage you to come down to the talks in person in the future. I know already that none of you expect to be scared by images of witches and devils, because the images associated today with Halloween are ones that make us smile, as this young girl in a witch costume that the Twinkle Company sells for $29.99, and the devil costume sold to the left by Amscam for €9.99. Which is similar to the devil's costume that I wore in the first grade, which I still remember, but don't have anymore, unfortunately. Halloween in the late 20th and early 21st century is a fun day associated with youth dressing up in costumes and trick-or-treating. As I'll explain to you, there were macabre aspects associated with Halloween in the past. But even the first images of witches in visual culture are less macabre, but something quite different, which I'm not going to disclose yet because it would ruin the story. I want to share with you some of these images and introduce you to the celebration of Halloween in a broader historical context, explaining the origins of Halloween and the first images of witches and devils in European civilization, which originally were not associated with Halloween. And I'll then go on to discuss how these images became part of Halloween tradition as the celebration spread rather late from Europe to the Americas and then globally. It's a fascinating story, more fascinating than the commercial Halloween we celebrate today. Halloween has its origins as a pre-Christian Celtic festival, the festival of Samhain. By Celts, I'm not referring to English and Irish folk costumes, which most people associate with the Celts, but rather to the traditions of the Celt peoples who lived across much of Europe before the Romans and Germanic peoples arrived. The Romans and Germanic peoples pushed the Celts to the geographic fringes of European civilization, hence our misunderstanding that the Celts are associated only with British and Irish culture. They're not. They lived throughout much of Europe before the expansion of the Roman Empire. The Celtic festival of Samhain coincided with the beginning of winter, when herds were returned from pasture and land tenures were renewed. During the Samhain festival, the souls of those who had died in the remote past were believed to return to visit their homes, and those who had died during the year were believed to journey to the other world. The Celts set bonfires on hilltops for relighting their hearth fires for the winter and to frighten away evil spirits. And they sometimes wore masks and other disguises to avoid being recognized by ghosts thought to be present. It was in these ways that beings such as witches, hobgoblins, fairies, and demons came to be associated with the day. The period was also thought to be favorable for divination, that is, the practice of seeking knowledge of the future and the unknown by supernatural means on matters such as marriage, health, and death. When the Romans conquered the Celts in the 1st century of the Common Era, they added their own festivals of Feralia, commemorating the passing of the dead, and of Pomona, the goddess of the harvest. In the 7th century of the Common Era, Pope Boniface moved the feast of All Saints' Day, originally celebrated on May 13th. The date of All Saints' Day was moved to November 1st, perhaps in an effort to supplant the pagan holiday of Halloween with Christian observance. The evening before All Saints' Day became a holy or hallowed eve, hence Halloween. 2 days after Halloween and 1 day after All Saints' Day, November 2nd, was All Souls' Day, which was set aside for the commemoration of the dead, while All Saints' Day celebrated holy men and women in heaven. All Souls' Day honored all the faithfully departed, not just saints, but all the faithfully departed. In this way, by moving All Saints' Day to November 1st, Halloween entered the annual celebration of popular and religious festivals in Latin Christianity as part of an interesting complex of related celebrations. On this chart, you will see the triad complex of Halloween, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day that preceded the Advent period, the beginning of the beginning of the liturgical year that then preceded Christmas. You'll see that I've identified All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day as liturgical feast days, part of the official church calendar, and Halloween as a popular celebration, what religious historians sometimes call quasi-liturgical feasts. I'll come back to some of these other feast days and celebrations, especially Fat Tuesday or Mardi Gras, towards the end of the talk. And I'll come back to this chart also later on. But there are a few other important things to note in these developments. First is that we see in the annual feast celebrated by Europeans an amalgam of popular pagan and Christian celebrations, which is a characteristic feature of European culture. In this case, the conversions of pagan Halloween with the religious liturgical feast of All Saints' Day and All Hallows' Day, which solemnly commemorate saints, martyrs, and the dead. Second, Halloween reflects different traditions connected to embracing life on earth and the afterlife, the natural and the supernatural, which are at the core of all religious traditions. The third thing to note is that the celebration of the Celtic festival of Samhain involved masking and witches, demons, and goblins. However, we don't know what these witches and goblins look like, or rather what the Celts thought that they look like, or do we know if Halloween continued to be celebrated during Roman times and the early Middle Ages. Many world cultures and societies have figures of demons and witches, but the Western image of the witch, and the popularized image of the devil, first emerged somewhat late in the 14th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, the period known as the Late Middle Ages, contrary to what most people believe that they are medieval images. The Western images of witches and demons arose in conjunction with the Great European Witch Hunt, a 300-year period from approximately 1450 to 1750 of the Common Era, where tens of thousands of people, mostly but not exclusively women, were charged and tried for the crime of witchcraft. The Great European Witch Hunt was a major judicial, social, political, and religious operation that was not an aberration, but lay at the intersection of important developments in European history, and is the subject of ongoing interdisciplinary research. I teach a class at WMU on the Great Witch Hunt, and there are classes at many other universities across the country also on it. Pertinent, though, to today's topic is that in this period, a specific Western image of the witch first emerged. The image did not emerge as a package, broomstick, black clothes, hat, but evolved piecemeal. One of the first court cases against a witch was in Ireland that dates to the middle of the 14th century of the Common Era, involving an accusation of maleficia, that is, bad, harmful, or black magic, of a woman poisoning her husband. Healers who practiced good or white magic had always existed in Europe and were never a problem. But in the late Middle Ages, there arose an interest in those individuals who practiced harmful magic. To the charge of maleficia was now added that the accused were influenced by the devil, a figure which had attracted the attention of theologians a century earlier at the University of Paris and other medieval universities. An entire theology of how the devil operated, referred to as demonology, developed. Now in the late Middle Ages, according to theologians, witches entered into a pact with the devil, usually through sexual intercourse. Alongside performing harmful magic and entering into a pact with the devil. A third defining characteristic emerged of witches as well, namely that they often met with the devil and other witches in nighttime meetings or gatherings called the Sabbath. What I'm suggesting here is that all societies, Asian, African, and the first peoples of North America, had some witch or devil figures, but European society, for the first time in the late Middle Ages, developed a quite specific and distinctive concept and images of witches and devils. Let me show you now some of the early images we have of witches and devils, and I'll point out some things along the way, and then I'm going to stop and see what strikes you that might be interesting about them, or what questions you might have, so that we have maybe a little discussion going on and not just a one-way presentation. The first is an engraving entitled "The Witch" from around 1500 by the famous German artist Albrecht Dürer. Dürer is best known for engravings of religious themes, such as the praying hands, Adam and Eve, and the German reformer Martin Luther. You might wonder, why would someone strongly interested in religion also be interested in witches? Well, we need to understand that concern with witches and the devil was not separate from, but connected to religion and salvation. And this was the height of the witch hunt. Dürer's depiction of the witch is not dissimilar from our images today of the witch, with long flowing hair and a broomstick. However, what is different, one of the things that's different, is that this witch and many other images of European witches I'm going to show you are depicted naked without any clothes. I'm going to just stop for one moment so you can just look at this before I move on. We can come back to it. We can come back to it later if you have questions. One artist who was quite prolific, perhaps the most prolific in depicting witches, was Hans Baldung, known as Grien, a German who was a contemporary of Albrecht Dürer. And here's a woodcut, entitled "The Witches" by Hans Baldung from 1510. Here is a painting by Baldung entitled "Two Witches" from 1523. Here are the standing witch with the monster from 1515, with the monster in the form of a serpent, a common representation of the devil, and the witch's Sabbath from 1510. These latter two images clearly show the cumulative Western image of the witch as someone who conducts harmful magic after a pact with the devil that's been consummated through sexual intercourse, in this case with the serpent, and who gathers with other witches in nightly Sabbaths. What's especially noticeable in many of these images, is a depiction of witches not just without clothes, but with eroticized naked bodies. Not something we associate today with witches outside of our commercialized Halloween, or a depiction you would think would come from a society that is persecuting witches. These are the type of images I made reference to at the beginning of the talk. That's in contrast to many of the images we have today. this eroticism has been the topic of a lot of scholarly attention, for which there's no definitive explanation. But most scholars point to the sexualized nature of witches as a reflection of the fear that society had that witches were transgressing social and religious norms. The art historian Ivan Owens reads these images against the humanist intellectual milieu of Renaissance Germany, arguing that classical and medieval medicine and natural philosophy interpreted female anatomy as toxic, defective, and dangerously beguiling. According to Owens, Baldung exploited this radical polarity to create something that is both moralizing and titillating. As I mentioned earlier, devils received a lot of attention by medieval theologians 2 or 3 centuries before the witch hunt, who created a whole new theological field, demonology. However, there wasn't as strong a visual record of devils in the Middle Ages as there are for witches in the early modern period. Here are 2 depictions of devils from the Middle Ages, one in an illumination of the first temptation of Christ that appeared in a 13th century Psalter, a book of Psalms. The other is from a 15th century illuminated edition of St. Augustine's City of God. Both of these images are in costly, handwritten and illuminated edition, which means that they were aimed at an educated, not popular audience. Most ordinary people wouldn't see things like this. But one place ordinary people in the Middle Ages could see images of the devil and demons were on churches, such as this frieze over a door of the Lincoln Cathedral in the United Kingdom, and on the right the imp, the little devil, or the devil's helper, located in another part of the Lincoln Cathedral and a number of other churches in England. The outbreak of the Great European Witch Hunt, which inspired paintings and woodcuts by Dürer, Grien, and many others, brought a clear image of the devil and demons to ordinary people. So that's something that came later, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, not in the Middle Ages. Before moving on, I do want to stop here and see what sort of reactions or questions you might have to any of these images. Yes, in the back.
It's about these sort of cherubic, angel-like creatures that are kind of hanging around with the witches. What's the story with them?
And can you point to one particular?
In the previous slide, I think it was, no, one more back, especially those 4 on the bottom.
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question for others here and also for the streaming audience. Understood the question is, what are these cherubic figures? How do we understand these cherubic figures at the bottom of this woodcut below the image of the witch on top? Anyone have any suggestions? When we're dealing with something like this, I could give you more. I'll give you maybe my impressions, but there's no definitive answer. Yes.
It's almost as though the witches dominating the cherubim, because the witch is on top of the lion, and the cherubim are down below, and so they're being downtrodden.
Yeah. So the contribution was that we have the cherubic figures on the bottom, almost they're holding up the image of the witch. So yeah, iconographically, we see that there. Any other observations or questions to that? Yes?
Not necessarily to that, but what I was noticing in the slides, the witch is basically riding like a goat for the most part. And what is the symbolism behind that?
I don't know about the symbolism of the goat, but what I think a number of you has pointed out here is that in some of these, like in this one by Dürer, we don't just have the witch, but we have other figures you would think not associated with that. You're seeing a juxtaposition here of the strife for societal norms, and then the witches that are transgressing them. And perhaps here that the witch has beguiled these cherubic figures to turn them over to her side.
She's riding backwards.
Yep.
Should be?
She's riding backwards. She's facing the rear end of the goat.
Yep.
Instead of looking where she's going.
Yes.
So I was thinking that the cherub figures are also children. And, the witch is obviously depicted typically as a woman, a female, who, raised the children. And so that whole kind of idea of children either being, led astray by a wicked female.
So the contribution here was that these cherubic figures needed to understand they're sort of children here, and what's being juxtaposed there. I mean, in this particular image, also I didn't point out, it's an older woman. So you have these age different. Many older women were one of the targets of the witch hunt, particularly older women. Those that were the most, we consider, we look back and consider that society saw as one of the most dangerous, and particularly then a sexualized older woman. I guess it's a question here whether we want to look at, the cherubs look like younger children, whether they're representing of children or some other, these cherubic figures that have another connotation. So, there's a lot here. Any observations or comments or questions on any of the others? The sort of sexualized nature has been has often been overlooked. Last evening, I was contacted by a reporter who knew of this lecture today, and I was interviewed on a local radio station. And the reporter wanted some of the images to show, and when the show finally came out on the 11 o'clock news, none of these images were there. I suspect they found them too risque. They need some sort of explanation. These have fascinated scholars for a while.
Can you talk at all about what sexual attitudes were like at that time period? I don't really know. I've heard, various things.
A lot of our understandings of what we think sexuality was like in pre-modern times are sort of stereotypes we have. That don't hold. We do know that this was a period particular. So if we're looking at these pictures coming from 16th century Germany, where Reformation has been introduced, that we do know that civic authorities and not just religious authorities undertook sort of a thorough relook at issues like sexual norms and marriage, particularly in the German lands. And what is clear, we know from accusations of witches, that's one of the dangers. These are in many ways that witches are transgressing religious, social, moral norms. Yes?
I don't know what it is, a torch, a trumpet, or whatever, the little figure behind the woman on the right looks like it's connected somehow to the giant, threatening, overwhelming sky.
So the contribution was that it looks like that on the right, this woman holding this sort of bowl. What's in there? Is that an apple? It looks like to me, or something else. Is holding it up against this threatening, what looks like a threatening sky that is there. I'm not prepared to talk about the iconography of these paintings. It's also not part of my sort of training. Is that an apple relating to Eve? But you're all pointing out very important elements of this. I mean, there's more there than just the two figures. Looks to be another goat again or something. Let's get back to Halloween. So to underscore again, these were images that first developed in the late Middle Ages. Witches. Early medieval society didn't have this what's called the cumulative image of a witch as someone who conducts maleficia, harmful magic, is someone who does that in a pact with the devil, and someone that meets with the devil and other witches in a Sabbath. That didn't exist in antiquity. It didn't exist in the early Middle Ages. Again, medieval society had images of devils. It was a large concern among intellectuals, scholastic, if those of you know about the Middle Ages, scholastic intellectuals at universities, but not so much visual images that I would say were popularized ones. And it's the witch hunt that will then bring the images of the devils into the images of the witch hunt. We don't know exactly when our modern Halloween was first celebrated. It does appear to be a rather minor rather than a major day of celebration in the annual popular and religious feasts in Europe. As I explained earlier, the roots of the modern celebration of Halloween began once the festival was appropriated by Christianity. The British Isles appears to be a place where the old Celtic and new Christian traditions fervently mingled and coalesced. In parts of Ireland, Halloween was, and even still is, known as the Vigil of Samhain. Throughout Britain, Britain in the Central Middle Ages, Hallows Eve became a night of vigil, prayer, and fasting in preparation for the next day when the saints were where the saints were honored in a more tame celebration. The old ways had not died out. However, the bonfires were still lighted, only now in honor of Christian heroes, and And the turning of the seasons was still observed, now in the glory of Christ. In medieval England, there appears to have been an association of Halloween with youth and with the practices of roasting nuts and a sport practiced by young people known as apple ducking, attempting to seize an apple floating in a tub of water, a practice we recognize today. By the late 16th century, the practice of souling, or what we call trick-or-treating, had become integral. The poor would go about knocking on doors asking for a soul cake, or also known as a soul mass cake, in return for prayers. When the British came to North America, they brought many of their customs with them, but interestingly, not Halloween. The Puritans of New England, who refused to observe any holidays which they considered to be associated with pagan beliefs, which oddly included Christmas and Easter, at least as they were celebrated at the time, along with Halloween, kept the observance, though, of another Halloween-like celebration, Guy Fawkes Day, which fell on November 5th. Guy Fawkes Day was celebrated by the Protestants of Britain as a triumph over popery, that is, the influence of the popes. And November 5th became an occasion for anti-Catholic sermons and vandalism of Catholic homes and businesses. On Guy Fawkes Night, bonfires were lit, and unpopular figures, most often the Pope, were hanged in effigy while people drank, feasted, and set off fireworks. Children and the poor would go house to house, often wearing masks, begging for money or treats, while threatening vandalism if they refused. Guy Fawkes Night continued to be celebrated in the British North American colonies until the American Revolution, till the end of the 18th century. The rituals of Samhain really arrived in the United States less than a century later with the displacement of the Irish during the potato famine of 1845-1849. The Irish, largely Catholics, continued to celebrate All Hallows Eve, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day, along with the practice of souling, sort of trick-or-treating. And by now, these festivals were infused with folk tradition, such as jack-o'-lanterns. The jack-o'-lantern is associated with the Irish folk tale of Stingy Jack, a clever drunk and con man who fooled the devil into banning him from hell, but because of his sinful life, could not enter heaven. After his death, he roamed the world, carrying a small lantern made of a turnip with a red-hot ember from hell inside to light his way. On All Hallows Eve, the Irish hollowed out turnips and carved them with faces, placing a candle inside, so that as they went about souling in the night, when the veil between life and death was thinnest, they would be protected from spirits of like Stingy Jack. Shortly after their arrival in the United States, the Irish traded the turnip for the pumpkin as their lantern of choice, as it was easier to carve than the turnip was. I would note, though, here too, as we're talking about North American customs early, that while Guy Fawkes Day was no longer celebrated in the United States after the American Revolution, aspects of it, especially vandalism, was transferred, and at first to what the Protestant British considered Catholic holidays at the very end of October: Halloween, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day. Only now it became indiscriminate. Anyone's house or business could be vandalized around October 31st, not just those of Catholics. This turnip lantern in the Manx Heritage Foundation and Museum, which is dedicated to preserving the Viking and Celtic heritage of the island, testifies to the survival of this and other ancient Celtic customs, which may have been present throughout Europe and even Britain, but were lost because of the advent of the Protestant Reformations of the 16th century. We don't know that, but that's possible. Later, North Americans added their own mark on Halloween, especially a woman named Elizabeth Krebs from the village of Hiawatha, Kansas. Has anyone ever heard of her? She's an interesting figure and important in American Halloween. On the morning after Halloween in 1912, Krebs finally grew tired of having her garden and entire town vandalized once a year by marauding children wearing masks, and she tried to initiate her own resources, organizing a party a year later in 1913 for the young people, where she hoped they would get tired out and they wouldn't have any more energy left for destruction. She underestimated their determination, and the community was vandalized in 1913 as usual. A year later, 1914, she involved now the entire town. She brought in a band, held a costume contest, put on a parade, and her plan seemed to work. People of all ages began to enjoy a festive rather than disruptive Halloween. News of her success traveled outside of Kansas to other towns and cities which adopted the same course and established Halloween parties, which included costume contests, parades, music, food, dancing, and sweet treats, accompanied by frightening, entertaining decorations of ghosts and goblins. So not frightening and not entertaining, but frightening and entertaining images of decorations of ghosts and goblins. In the early 20th century, Halloween morphed into a community-based event with neighborhood get-togethers and children's parties. And by the mid-century, it had lost almost all of its earlier religious tones and had become mainly an inexpensive way for kids to get together and indulge or pretend. The scariest part of Halloween today are not the witches, devils, and goblins, but its commercialization that began in the last 3 decades of the 20th century. Today, as was noted, it's a $6.9 billion business. The commercial costumes and Halloween stores that pop up in empty stores in strip malls earlier and earlier, even here in Kalamazoo and Portage, are only the tip of the iceberg of this commercialization. There's something slightly unsavory, and not just in the ghoulish sense, about the way Halloween has become just another means for huge corporations like Disney to cross-promote their blockbuster characters, and for social media with sites such as Pinterest, helping drive demand for costumes from millennials who seem to have a disturbing penchant for any kind of dress up that appears sexy in the name, like these tipsy elf costumes that tell us we should dress up as the most eye-catching version of a typically spooky creature in our sexy Halloween costumes. It's this American-style commercialized Halloween that has been exported to many places around the globe, including places in Asia and Europe. You might remember a stampede that occurred at a Halloween street party last year in Seoul, Korea, that claimed the lives of 159 people. I'm going to be interested to see whether tonight there'll be a street party in Korea. For some, Halloween is an excuse just to dress up and to have fun. The could be traditional ghosts and devils and witches, like this celebration in Indonesia, or in Hong Kong, as the photo suggests, some Asian motifs. In other places, as in this weird costume or figure from Bavaria, something else is going on, I suspect. What we have is probably not evidence of a real celebration, but of its appropriation for commercial purposes, an opportunity to draw people to markets and farms, what we might call the capitalization of agritourism. I could think of some examples in Kalamazoo about that also. In Great Britain and Ireland, I explained, Halloween is still celebrated, but outside of these lands, Halloween is not embraced, or should I say no longer embraced, by most Europeans since the late Middle Ages. However, a new style, American commercialized Halloween, is marketed in Europe to British, Irish, and American tourists, no less than by the European rail system, trying to sell tickets to spooky castles, dark forests, and age-old legends. If you were to click further on the site, the popular destinations they're suggesting you might want to go to are Dracula-inspired castles in Transylvania and Romania, the Black Forest in Germany, I guess, because as the name suggests, it must be dark, and the old city of Prague with Gothic buildings, nothing that has to do with the original European Halloween. The German company that produces the iconic gummy bears has marketed in the last few years a whole new line of gummy candy with Halloween motifs. It's serious business that involves not just repackaging. It isn't just a repackaging for Halloween of gummy bears, but new candy molds with Halloween designs, these ghostly gummies and sour vampire bats that I distributed to you. What we see here is a wholesale marketing of Halloween to sell back to Americans its own commercialized version of a celebration that isn't celebrated anymore in most places of Europe. And the success of the German discount supermarket Aldi in America helps to do that, as well as our own Myers, where if you like these gummies and sour bats, you can buy them today if they haven't been sold out yet. Let me stop now with my discussion of the cynical commercialization of Halloween. And for the last part of my talk, let me highlight how Halloween's place in the traditional annual calendar of popular and religious festivities, which I talked about earlier, by pointing out some similarities and differences with related festivities in southern United States, Latin America, and Europe, which are still traditional in character or have traditional elements. The Day of the Dead, which originally fell on November 1st, All Saints' Day, but depending on its locality, is celebrated today in Mexico and other parts of Central and Latin America over a 3-day period from Halloween to All Souls' Day. The Day or Days of the Dead is dedicated to prayer and remembrance of friends and family members who have died. It's celebrated with colorful skulls and skeletons. Mexicans construct small sitting rooms that are directly attached to graves, creating a little building that they can spend time in. They bring in the favorite food and drinks of the departed, play their favorite music, and pass the day in the cemetery socializing with the souls of the departed. Originating as a religious holiday brought over by the Spaniards It incorporates elements of traditional Native American belief systems. Old guards are remixed as Catholic saints. Like the Celtic celebration of the Feast of Samhain, which Rome couldn't stamp out, the traditions of the Day of the Dead absorbed and reconfigured older customs. Like Halloween, it also involved the wearing of costumes or special dress. Another set of festivities that I'd like to bring to your attention, which also came out of a fusion of popular secular and religious traditions and involved the wearing of costumes, are carnival celebrations. Carnival originated and continues to thrive in various parts of Europe in a number of versions. Let's go back to this chart here now. So if Halloween, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day, this triad, make up the season that precedes Advent, the beginning of the liturgical year, that precedes Christmas. Carnival is a season refers to as Shrovetide, that precedes the Lenten season, that culminates in Easter, the height of the liturgical year. The Carnival or Shrovetide season officially officially begins with the Feast of the Epiphany or Three Kings, and ends on Fat Tuesday, which is the day before Ash Wednesday, which is the official beginning of Lent. European carnival's roots stretch back also to pagan times, like Halloween, where an early version of the festival also celebrated the god of the harvest. Over the centuries, it has evolved into a time of merriment, where people often indulge in excessive consumption of alcohol, meat, and other foods that will be abstained during the upcoming Lenten season. Other common features of Carnival involve mock battles, such as food fights, expressions of social satire, mockery of authorities, costumes of the grotesque body that display exaggerated features such as large noses, bellies, mouths, phallic objects, or elements of animal bodies, depictions of disease and gleeful death, and a general reversal of everyday rules and norms. Today, Carnival is celebrated in parades, public street parties, and other entertainments, in some places combining elements of a circus. Elaborate costumes and masks allow people to set aside their everyday individuality and experience a heightened sense of social unity. Carnival is strongest in European countries that are predominantly Catholic, such as the famous Carnival in Venice. But in Germany and some neighboring regions, which went through reformations in the 16th century, Carnival is still strong in both Catholic and Protestant areas, such as the Rhineland, northern Rhineland, which is Catholic, and southwest Germany, which is Protestant. And you just get a sense from some of these images that the celebrations of Carnival are different in these different areas. Europeans brought Carnival to the Americas, just as they did Halloween. The French brought their Fat Tuesday or Mardi Gras celebrations to the city of New Orleans, where it thrives today as an amalgam of the original French customs, Creole, Caribbean, Spanish, and African American elements. And the Portuguese brought their carnival celebrations to Brazil, which has its own interesting amalgam of various elements. So for this last slide, excuse me for 1 second. As a child, Halloween ranked for me with Christmas as my two favorite holidays of the year, which religious leaders would have frowned on and probably did. But I've been very happy to share with you today this day with you and bring back some of the joy. But I want to leave the last word to this young Scottish woman.
Nervous. Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought we could do something a bit more fun, and that is some Scottish Gaelic words for Halloween, seeing as it's coming up. So the Scottish Gaelic word for Halloween is Eiche Helme. Eiche Helme. Eiche. I'm nervous. Hello and welcome back to my channel.
Yeah.
Today I thought we could do something a bit more fun, and that is some Scottish Gaelic words for Halloween, seeing as it's coming up. So the Scottish Gaelic word for Halloween is Eiche Helme. Eiche Helme. Eiche Helme. Or if you were to wish someone personally, I hope you have a happy Halloween. Eiche Helme Honnegut. Eiche Helme Honnegut. So some words that we might use around Halloween, we're going to say the word for ghost. Now ghost is taish, taish, taish. And the word for monster would be uleveist. Uleveist.
Can I get some help turning this off?
Uleveist. Word for pumpkin, pipak. 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 And the word for turnip, if you're Scottish like me, it would be...
Okay, so, sorry there. So, the first presentation I put in a video. I don't do this teaching in university, and you see it doesn't always work. You would have got some images there. So, any other comments or questions about anything else I talked about, or if you even wanted to go back to the other images? I don't know if this takes away a lot of the joy of Halloween. What illuminates it or takes away some of the joys? Yes.
We were living in Sweden for 2 years in the late 90s, and on Hallows Eve, the tradition was that you could take the train, we were living in Stockholm, and you could take the train out to one of the big cemeteries outside of the city, and families would go out to the cemetery, and they would have lanterns with them, paper lanterns often, and take picnics and food, and they would go to the grave sites of family members, and they would spend time there with their families, and they would have shared memories, and
So
make it a joyous occasion also.
So someone mentioning that even in Sweden on Halloween night, you were talking about Halloween night. Oh, All Hallows Eve, which is Halloween night of going to cemetery. There might. That's interesting that there will be. I'm saying very localized places where some of these is still practiced outside of Britain, but much of what you'll see, I think, throughout most of Europe is sort of in a commercialized version. But that's interesting that this still is, and that sort of reminds us to the Latin American custom where they're combining elements of Halloween with all the days of the dead that Latin Americans do. So thanks for sharing that. So I think we're sort of at the end, right? 1 p.m. So thanks for coming out.